in terms of mental health, why is it so important?
Gosh, yeah. Yeah, this is a conversation I feel like that can be had over and over again and still be relevant because it really shapes, I mean, how we show up in every aspect of life, how we love, how we lead, the ways that we create, the ways that we connect. I think it's a foundation of our humanity because if we don't feel like we're well, or if we feel like we're not at ease, yeah, we just show up differently. Like maybe people are not able to recognize or label it all the time or pick out the emotions, but we know when we are like ourselves and we know when we're unlike ourselves, even though we're not able to pinpoint exactly what that is. And I think unfortunately, because we live in a fallen world, it also can serve as a foundation for our healing.
What's up, fam? Welcome back to Big Picture Podcast, where we discuss faith, testimonies, and perspectives. I post every other Wednesday. I'm your host, Susan Obi, and for today's topic, we will be discussing mental health, just because this is something that has been on my mind more recently, of really thinking about how to define mental health and what are some practical ways to make sure that we're staying healthy in our minds. And I think that just recently, that's something that's been on my mind. Even though I've talked about it before in the past, I think it's always an important and relevant topic. So I was thinking about, who can I have this conversation with? What are some um, important factors regarding mental health, and who are some experts in the field? And I thought about Robina. So Robina and I actually attended grad school together, University of Missouri, different programs, same school, and just ran in some of the same circles. And Robina is really big on mental health. And I'll actually let Robina introduce herself. So Robina, Dr. Robina, can you tell the people just who you are and what you do and a little bit of your background?
Hey y'all. So thanks, Susan. Yeah, I'm happy to be here on Big Picture, and I love what you're doing with it and just open to sharing my perspective today as well to make some more connections. I am a licensed clinical psychologist. I got my PhD in counseling psychology from Mizzou, which is where I met Susan, like she said. And now I practice kind of in two ways, more full time as a business psychologist, which means I do leadership and executive coaching as well as organizational consulting for for companies. And in that regard, I help with things that have to do with talent management, and one of my focuses that I'm leaning into now is the well-being, like workplace well-being. So it goes into mental health as well. And then part-time, I do the clinical work. So assessments, therapy, I'm thinking about stepping back into that. Still thinking about what that would look like for me. I'm Kenyan. I was born in the States, so I have that perspective of like the bicultural living and what that looks like for us mental health wise. And yeah, I was born in Maryland. Yeah.
All right, that's awesome. Yeah, I'm also first generation, and I think there's so many factors to think about in regards to mental health. So we'll kind of touch
hmm
on culture a little bit. So Rubina, how would you define mental health?
Yeah, I know oftentimes when people talk about mental health, it's usually when there's some sort of illness going on, or I say dis-ease, as we talk about it in Black psychology. But I don't just think about it as the absence of illness. I think about it being like a state of alignment. So when our body and our spirit are participating in a cohesive sort of dialogue with our minds, or within our minds, rather, I think the ideal state is when there are elements of being emotionally aware, spiritually grounded, and those states help to offer us tools to where we can self-regulate, to where we can return to peace after we've experienced some sort of disruption, and also the ability to expand our joy from within. And then there's also, for me, I think a social connectedness part to it too, that offers us support and opportunities to relate to others in ways that are life-giving.
Yeah, that's really good. You said a lot that I'm thinking through. You mentioned Black psychology. Can you kind of
Mhm.
go into that a little bit more? Maybe someone's wondering, what does that mean?
Yeah, so Black psychology in the ways that I've studied it, and just know of through the Association of Black Psychologists and also other psychologists, Black psychologists who center African individuals or African descended individuals in their practice, is being able to account for who we are, not just as a physical body and, the race and the things that have come through being the race that we have been labeled as within the systems of oppression. It also accounts for the spiritual nature of how we move through the world. Like, we are spiritual beings, and we do have oftentimes like able to connect ourselves to a higher power, whether it be God. For some people, they might view that differently as Africans, but we have that connection to each other through that our creator that has put us on this earth. And so with African Black psychology, there is a respect for that and how that impacts the way that we move through life. And it centers our experiences, whereas a lot of us, myself included, being, trained at Mizzou, have come from a very Eurocentric Western lens of looking at psychology and pathologizing the things that we may go through as individuals as a whole, but especially as Black people, to where in the past, even things that we did that were just normal to us, or things that we did that were abnormal or atypical, like having to try to escape slavery, were labeled as disorders, like drapetomania or something like that. So, yeah, African Black psychology is just a way to be able to look at us from a lens that centers us, that also has a respect and space for the spiritual essence, the things that we can't necessarily tangibly label, but we know that impact our experience as human beings, yeah, on this earth.
Yeah, I really love that answer. I'm getting like just I'm happy that we're having this conversation
Hmm.
just because it's something that I do think about mental health, but then also how culture plays a role in that for me specifically.
Yeah.
And I talked a little bit about this in one of my episodes earlier this year. So I traveled to Nigeria over Christmas last year and New Year's,
Hmm.
and that's where my family's from. I was born and raised in Georgia, but I mean, my parents came from Nigeria, so my ancestors are from there.
Yeah.
So I shared my experience of fun things that we did and meeting my family and meeting some of my family members for the first time, but it was a lot deeper than that, which I didn't really go into, but I just really enjoyed and felt there was something really significant about going back to where my family is from. Something that is kind of
Hmm.
hard to describe, but a lot of joy and fulfillment and just satisfaction. And I don't know, just feel connected more to myself and who I am.
Yeah.
Cause it's like, this is actually where I came from. I'm stemming from these roots here. So there was something that just clicked that I'm like, this feels right. It doesn't feel just like a
Hmm.
trip. So I'm
Yeah, that
happy.
even makes me kind of think about the trips that I've taken to Kenya and how each time I end up feeling a lot more connected in that way. And Black psychology as a, I guess I would say, field of study, because I mean, it's always existed even before we started to label it in that way. As we know it now, it kind of emerged as a response, and I guess I would say like a reclamation a response to the Eurocentric frameworks that I talked about that pathologized Blackness, and then like reclaiming our culture, and then that spiritual part, and then the communal ways that we can understand the mind and our ways of being. So when you talk about going back home to a place that you weren't born, but there's that ancestral connection and you just feel differently. And sometimes it's hard to explain, but I think that is part of the essence of Black psychology, like our psyche, like our spiritual knowing of, okay, I'm in this place. It's not, what I've known growing up, but I have a connection to it. And yeah, I think that's a really powerful experience for us to have as Black people.
Yeah, and it's definitely true. And I like how you're just emphasizing how we are spiritual beings. And then you talked about finding joy from within and not necessarily from what's going on around us. So a lot of
Hmm.
the spiritual realm, not just even thinking about religion, but just generally, spirituality plays a role in how we experience life and how we view the world, and even gives us a deeper understanding of what's happening around us. In terms of mental health, why is it so important?
Gosh, yeah. Yeah, this is a conversation I feel like that can be had over and over again and still be relevant because it really shapes, I mean, how we show up in every aspect of life, how we love, how we lead, the ways that we create, the ways that we connect. I think it's a foundation of our humanity because if we don't feel like we're well, or if we feel like we're not at ease, yeah, we just show up differently. Like maybe people are not able to recognize or label it all the time or pick out the emotions, but we know when we are like ourselves, and we know when we're unlike ourselves, even though we're not able to pinpoint exactly what that is. And I think, unfortunately, because we live in a fallen world, it also can serve as a foundation for our healing.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And in thinking about mental health and how you just discussed why it's so important, I know that there are various avenues to make sure that we are staying healthy in our minds, and therapy is one of those. But
Hmm.
this is another question that I just thought of as you were talking, and we're talking about culture. I know that in certain cultures, therapy is not really as emphasized or as relevant, I guess,
Yeah.
as maybe in Western culture. And I guess you can speak to it a little bit more. I'm thinking specifically about African culture, which, of course, there's different countries in Africa, but just generally, we don't really see that being as talked about. But for me, I do think some therapy is something that has been helpful for me in some ways, and I think anyone can benefit from it. So, how would you say that therapy is helpful for mental health? Is it necessary? And why are we not really seeing that talked about across the globe?
Yeah. This is such a loaded question. Um, but I'm going to try to organize my thought as I'm responding to you. With the culture element, um, I think it's very valid for us to consider that because that is the lens that people use to make meaning through the world, or one of the lenses that we use to make meaning through the world, because it informs our values, like how we express our emotions, and then to this topic, how we heal or what we think that wellness looks like. And yeah, unfortunately, in many African traditions and cultures, mental health hasn't always been considered in the ways that we look at it now. As I guess I would say this generation has become a bit more open to it. But the essence of who we are collectivistic people, and we are people that are always self actualizing and moving towards healing or betterment. And we're people who, like Ubuntu, that phrase where it talks about like I am or I exist because you exist. We recognize the humanity in each other. Um, And as African people, we've always used stories and rituals and different spiritual practices to connect, and sometimes heal. We may not have seen it as that, but that's kind of what it was. So I really, you know, don't like that we've gotten to a point in society where, as Black people, we don't feel like therapy is for us, because I think it's just another tool or a different way of looking at storytelling and how storytelling can be healing. But it also does make sense that we have kind of this taboo about approaching, or this hesitation about approaching it, because um, ongoing historically, and the ongoing relationship that African Black people have with the carceral system, like such as, like, prisons and prison industrial complex, and like medical institutions, including like the psychiatric institutions and what they used to be like, especially here, in the States. Like, it's so deeply intertwined in oppression, and those have not typically been spaces that have offered Black people care, even though we should trust people within those systems to be there for our well-being. They haven't been. So I think that is one element that has kind of trickled down to where you have grandparents that have repeated messages to their children, who are now our parents, who are like, you can't trust these people. Like, don't talk about that information outside of the household. We only keep that here, and those people can't help you, things like that. I think that stuff makes a big difference for what we see now. And thankfully, our generation in some ways has a little bit more of a privilege of time and space, to where we're not going off of survival in the same ways that our immigrant families were, or our families that were coming up out of the civil rights movement were, for like our siblings and cousins who were in the States. um, but yeah, I think there's just so much to it that it makes sense why we are hesitant. And then to your response of why it matters or why it could be helpful. Yeah, again, just going back to the context, we can't separate our mental health as Black people from history and identity. But in order for us to move towards liberation, I think there's a lot of things that we need to consider in our healing process. And we already know that we are people who are resilient. We have a lot of wisdom. We also have a lot of intergenerational joy that we can pull from. But we do need to find ways to kind of like take out the vestiges or those remnants of what enslavement and colonization and systemic racism has done to us, to where we've internalized a lot of those things that are not ours to hold. And therapy, or even, like cultural healing circles, which that's one of the things that we do through the Association of Black Psychologists, is like Sawubona healing circles. So more culturally appropriate care. They're not therapy, but they're close to what we know of as African people through that storytelling and collective healing. Those are tools that can help us to start to get closer to our true like essence, and hopefully take away some of that dis-ease as we unpack a lot of the things that are in our minds and in our bodies as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like that answer. And you kind of answered a question that I was thinking of as you were talking of what are other ways to kind of get back to our true essence. I know therapy
Hmm.
is something that a lot of people are very familiar with, but then you went into some specific um I guess mechanisms within African culture of thinking about storytelling and
Hmm.
passing down wisdom from ancestors, and using, there are a lot of adages that at least I know in Nigerian culture, and you talked about intergenerational joy and a phrase
Hmm.
that talks about I exist because you exist, of just kind of having each other. So there are other ways outside of therapy, but then you emphasize, well, therapy can still be a helpful tool to get us back to our true essence and kind of filter out things that shouldn't be essentially part of our mindset, just based on
Hmm.
experience and going through the world as Blacks.
Yeah.
So um I will ask this question. So maybe we have a baby boomer listening, an African baby boomer, a Generation X, and kind of wondering, well, what is therapy? What is actually supposed to be happening in therapy? Because I have heard this. I've heard this from people, but I feel like I'm thinking of Africans, just either family or friends, when describing what therapy
Yeah.
is. And I'll just let you say what therapy is and what it isn't, just to clarify.
Yeah. So to like my parents' age, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
Um, Therapy. At the very basic level, it is